Thank you. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the PRC's malign activities in Europe, as well as discuss what U.S. and Europe, as European policymakers, can and are doing to counter this influence. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. For decades, the transatlantic alliance has been the cornerstone of American national security and a force multiplier for preserving the Western rules-based order. From the global threat of Soviet imperialism to the evil that struck this nation on 9/11, 23 years ago today, our alliance has faced countless threats together and remains strong. However, the threats are multiplied now. Once challenged only by the military and political ambitions of the Soviet Union, our alliance now faces the malign activities of both the Russian Federation as well as the People's Republic of China. Confronting China's aggression and coercion will be perhaps the defining challenge for the Western world in the 21st century. The United States cannot confront this challenge alone. As before, we need our European allies with us. Since 2019, the European Union has considered China to be a systemic rival. However, it also considers China to be a partner for cooperation and economic competitor. There is an obvious tension here. How can China be both a partner for cooperation, but also a systemic rival? Thankfully, it appears that some in Europe are willing to treat China like the rival that it is. China's significant support of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has led some in Europe to rightfully reevaluate their relationship with the PRC. The PRC is providing Russia with enormous quantities of dual-use goods, including semiconductors that support Russian military activities in Ukraine. It has also proved to be a willing accomplice in aiding Russia's attempts to circumvent Western sanctions. In the words of numerous officials in the Biden-Harris administration, this assistance from China has enabled Russia to, quote, reconstitute its military. Chinese troops may not be on the ground fighting alongside Russians, but China's aid to Russia's defense industrial base is undoubtedly enabling Putin's genocidal war of aggression to continue. This war is the greatest threat to the continent's security since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and many in Europe are deeply concerned that China has been aiding and abetting it for over 2 years. Despite this, Hungary continues to be a key strategic partner for China. It is an active participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative, serving as a crucial link in the logistics transport corridor between China and Europe. Hungary has even allowed Chinese police to operate inside Budapest, allegedly to help Hungary deal with increasing volumes of tourists from China. In Serbia, the government recently signed 28 cooperation agreements with the PRC, ranging from trade to media cooperation. Serbia is also perhaps the largest buyer of PRC military equipment on the European continent. Xi's motives are clear. He wants to create more economic and political dependencies among our allies in Europe that will constrain their ability to respond to future PRC aggression. He wants to join Putin in casting doubt on the reliability of the United States as an ally, driving a wedge between us and Europe and undermining the transatlantic alliance as a whole. Just as many in Europe have become standing up to Putin since his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I call on our allies in Europe to take the same approach to President Xi. His no-limits partnership with Putin is a clear threat to the Western world, and we must stand together to confront it. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any statement that he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. And I just want to extend my concern and hope for a swift recovery to Representative Joe Wilson. I have found him to be among the most trusted bipartisan partners in this committee, and particularly on issues that affect Ukraine, defending Ukraine, and Russia's illegal and immoral war of aggression. We all hope for a very swift recovery. The enduring global threat of Chinese malign influence represents a grave challenge to U.S. and transatlantic economic and national security. This challenge one more broadly posed by authoritarian governments to transatlantic democratic states, is not new. For decades, the Soviet Union and now Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China have sought to undermine European solidarity and transatlantic security. Despite China's geographical distance, which many European leaders use as an excuse to turn a blind eye to Beijing's actions, the People's Republic of China, with its economic might and its malign coercion, often couched as goodwill investment, poses a direct and pressing threat to European security. Today, Ukraine is at the forefront of Chinese influence in Europe. As Ukraine defends its freedom from Russian aggression, the Chinese government has become a quote-unquote decisive enabler of Russia's illegal war. Just yesterday, it was announced that in exchange for tangible military assistance to Russia, the Kremlin is providing Beijing with technologies related to submarines and missile capabilities. I commend the Biden-Harris administration not only for rallying the world to support Ukraine, but also for imposing sanctions on Chinese firms and other entities that back Russia's war effort. These firms and Chinese government must know their actions will not go unpunished. While China's support for Russia often makes headlines, its broader economic coercion and political influence campaigns across Europe pose serious threats. Nowhere is it more evident than in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban has not only welcomed Chinese malign investment into his country, but curried favor with Xi Jinping and his dark authoritarian vision of a less free and a more hostile global order. The Biden-Harris administration and our determined ambassador in Hungary, David Pressman, have made it very clear Prime Minister Orban's friendly relations with Xi Jinping pose significant dangers. Unfortunately, not everyone shares this view of Hungary and Orban's relationship with Xi. As we've seen, Donald Trump has called Orban smart and one of the most respected of men. This is a dangerous and reckless description of a person who's not only shuttered the rule of law and civil liberties, but also embraced his relationship with China, who so many here today in this room know is a threat to us here at home. Beyond Hungary, China has been aiming to influence its influence in the Western Balkans, particularly in Serbia. There, President Vučić has touted Serbia's ironclad friendship with China and has acquired Chinese drone and missile systems. China's strategic partnerships with various European national governments attempt to undermine the European Union's de-risking policies that seek to reduce dependency on critical supply chains and impose more scrutiny on inbound and outbound investments. While Hungary and Serbia deepen their ties with Chinese government, countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic have been clear-eyed about the national security risks associated with increased Chinese investment. Other countries like Ireland have taken important steps to bolster the inbound investment screening mechanisms, a crucial measure to identify and address malign investments. At the same time, many European leaders recognize Beijing's support for the Kremlin's war in Ukraine for what it is: two authoritarian governments aiming to undermine Ukraine's democratic sovereignty. We must be clear about the risk of failing to confront Beijing's malign influence in Europe. China is constantly observing how Europe responds to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Europe must remain aware of the risks and the potential threats to the continent's stability should the Chinese military escalate its aggressive stance in the South China Sea as well. The conflict in Ukraine and the potential contingency in Taiwan are inextricably linked, and I have no doubt that the United States and Europe must stand united against any malign aggression and investment from China, wherever it may occur. With that, I look forward to the testimony of our three distinguished witnesses on how the United States can further educate and work with our European partners about the risks associated with Chinese financing and the critical importance of continuing to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a panel of distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. Dr. Dalibor Bohach is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Peter Rao is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. And finally, Dr. Ivana Karaskova is the China team lead at the Association for International Affairs. Thank you for being here today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your verbal remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Dr. Bohach for his opening statement.
Chairman Keane, Ranking Member Keating, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to address you on this important subject today. My work at AEI focuses on political economy of Central and Eastern Europe and on the transatlantic partnership on which China has been casting an increasingly larger shadow in recent years, especially in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. My remarks provide a brief summary of my written statement, which I submitted for the record, which focuses on China's influence in Central and Eastern Europe proper. The regional picture in Central and Eastern Europe is as complicated and as contradictory at times as the wider European one, where the EU has been simultaneously seeing China as a negotiating partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. Some countries of the region, most notably Lithuania and the Czech Republic, have aligned themselves fully with the United States and are Indo-Pacific allies on the subject. Speakers of both chambers of the Czech Parliament have visited Taiwan on high-profile visits, angering the CCP. Lithuania has suffered an import ban from China following an upgrade of its own relations with Taiwan. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Hungary and Serbia have been deepening their ties with China. Viktor Orban sees Hungary as a pillar of the Belt and Road Initiative. He famously rebuked the Trump administration's 5G initiative back in 2019. Just last year, China was the largest foreign investor in Hungary, accounting for as much as 44% of all Chinese FDI in Europe. CATL, a major Chinese battery manufacturer, is planning to open a new battery plant in the southern eastern city of Debrecen worth up to $8 million, which would be the largest facility of its kind in Europe. And this April, Hungary borrowed €1 billion from Chinese banks, again, the largest loan of its kind in the country. The two countries also concluded a very opaque security cooperation agreement. In addition to Hungary and France, you may remember that Serbia was the third stop on Xi Jinping's European tour this year. And Serbia's President Vučić noted that the reverence and love that Xi encounters in our Serbia will not be found anywhere else. Over the years, China has invested into steel mills, mining, automotive sector in Serbia, in addition to large-scale infrastructure projects. Overall, Chinese loans have added around 3.7 billion euros to Serbia's public debt. Serbia, in addition to security cooperation arrangements with China, have also purchased Chinese medium-range anti-aircraft missile systems, Chinese drones, and in 2022, China was the largest supplier to Serbian military. Now, these cases on the opposite sides of the spectrum are not exactly representative of the region, which as I said, is very diverse and complicated. So in Western Balkans, you have countries that might not have an anti-Western or anti-American agenda, which nonetheless see Chinese loans and investment into infrastructure as desirable and tempting. China, as a result, now holds 40% of Montenegro's external public debt, 20% of North Macedonia's external public debt. In the case of NATO allies, this is a significant liability and potential source of Chinese blackmail. Further east, Georgia has now become a key battleground state, so to speak, which could be lost perhaps permanently to Chinese and Russian influence after the election this October. The ruling Georgian Dream Party has been reneging on its many Western commitments, and its location on the so-called Middle Corridor makes it an interesting country for for China to focus on. Anaklia, a deep sea port that was supposed to be developed by a US consortium, was awarded recently to a Chinese state-controlled entity instead. Now, before I conclude, just to turn to a very different example, Poland is a country that's been an exemplary ally to the United States, one that's not been a major destination for Chinese FDI, yet Polish officials would tell you that they want to have a constructive relationship with China. And Poland was indeed among the first countries to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's a country that joined the BRI initiative. And the rationale in Warsaw is that our Polish friends are trying to prevent a full Russian-Chinese alignment. This is something that really worries them very much. And this is something that I think policymakers in Washington have to reflect on as well, namely how to reassure our allies and how to sort of show them that China is not the path forward. I'll be very happy to answer any questions, particularly about US policy responses to this challenge going forward. But my message is simple: Europe and the Indo-Pacific are linked, and the China challenge cannot be addressed adequately without engagement with our European friends and allies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rohach. I now recognize Mr. Rao for his opening statement.
Chairman Keane, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic. With your permission, I would like to submit my written testimony into the record. As mentioned, my name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, where I serve as director of the Center for Europe and Eurasia. The views expressed in my testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing those of Hudson. Today, there are three, and really only three, major economic centers in the world: East Asia, Europe, and North America. The Sino-American competition we find ourselves in will be determined, in part, by the orientation of Europe. For the PRC to succeed, it needs to neutralize Europe on matters essential to its interest. It is for this reason that it seeks to break the transatlantic alliance, which has served as a major source of American power for decades. The PRC's primary military lever for attacking the European order is Russia, with which it has formed an alliance that is on display just this week through joint exercises in the Sea of Japan. To overcome Western sanctions, Russia depends on the PRC for dual-use items that are essential for its war effort, from machine tools to microelectronics. Russia has also looked to the PRC for macroeconomic relief. In 2023, two-way trade between the PRC and the Russian Federation reached a new high of $240 billion. It does not appear possible for the transatlantic alliance to wedge or split Russia from the PRC in the foreseeable future. Absent that possibility, the US should at least vector Sino-Russian strategic proximity to our advantage with our allies. The US should urge European leaders to put the war in Ukraine at the center of their relations with Beijing. Europeans have raised the war during their trips to Beijing, but often as one issue among many and with trade delegations in tow. The PRC is ceding the ground for the next great war in Europe. Europeans should make clear to Beijing that continued support for Russia, including in the supply of strategic dual-use items, will negatively impact all aspects of Sino-European relations. The PRC's primary economic lever for undermining European prosperity is its export-driven manufacturing model. The Chinese Communist Party has utilized state subsidies, intellectual property theft, market restrictions, technology transfers, regulatory interventions, and currency manipulation to gain control over global manufacturing choke points and supply chains in recent years. Since 2022, it has also profited from heavily discounted Russian oil. Chinese overcapacity poses a major threat to European industry, with all the attendant downsides to social cohesion. Europe's experience with solar technology, which it helped pioneer but is now dominated by the PRC, may only be a harbinger for the chemicals and auto industries. Today, US policymakers should worry as much about European economic decline as they should about Europe's trading surplus. While forging a fully fledged alternative trading system of rule-abiding states that excludes the PRC does not yet have sufficient support in the West, the US can make common cause with Europe against PRC dumping. Wherever possible, we should work collaboratively to diversify transatlantic supply chains, for example, in critical minerals, and counter Chinese dumping, as with electric vehicles. Such steps would protect the West against political extortion and prepare it for the PRC's ongoing decoupling from Western economies. The PRC has also worked to insinuate its products, instruments, and institutions into Europe's critical infrastructure. It has done this through elite capture, cyber espionage, key acquisitions, and the use of its diaspora. In those areas where it still relies on Western technology, like advanced lithography machines, it has also threatened reprisals over European export controls. It has become common practice for Washington to express shock and surprise at the scale of the China challenge, from the PRC's construction of vast numbers of missile silos to its establishment of extraterritorial police stations on US and European soil. It is very likely that public reporting on Chinese subversive activities in Europe constitutes only the tip of the iceberg. From the United Front's Confucius Institutes to Chinese-operated critical infrastructure, the PRC is working hard to subvert the continent. There are tools available to US policymakers to address this, if only we feel the urgency. For example, to counter Chinese infrastructure investment in Europe, like at the port of Piraeus, the US should embrace initiatives like the 13-country 3 Seas initiative, which Greece recently joined. However, to date, the Biden administration has declined to make an equity investment into TSI, and the $300 million loan it has set aside for infrastructure sits idle inexplicably. Europe is our forward operating base on the European landmass and the source of a great deal of American prosperity. The transatlantic alliance is one of the keys to winning the Sino-American competition this century, and I thank the committee for shedding light on this topic today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. I now recognize Dr. Karaskova for her opening statement.
Chair Keane, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Europe, it's my great pleasure and honor to address you today. With your permission, I would like to summarize my written testimony. My name is Ivana Karaskova. I work as a China team lead at the Association for International Affairs, a Prague-based foreign policy think tank and an NGO. And until March this year, I also served as a special advisor to the Vice President of the European Commission and a Commissioner for Values and Transparency. I consulted on the draft of the Defense of Democracy package, which should increase the transparency of financial flows into Europe and increase resilience of the European societies against malign foreign influence. In my today's short address, I would like to focus on 3 key issues: the state of play of Chinese interference in Europe, second, European response, and lastly, a possible way forward, including recommendations for the US. China initially viewed Europe as a potential ally against the United States in global governance. It focused on trade, technology exchange, and win-win cooperation. The perception, however, changed with the ascent of Xi Jinping into power, and he gradually initiated ideological reforms which emphasized nationalism. This domestic policy led to human rights violations, most notably, but not exclusively, in Xinjiang, deterioration of freedom in Hong Kong, and mismanagement in dealing with COVID-19 pandemic. Internationally, China became more aggressive in South China Sea, East China Sea, and cross-strait relations. And since approximately 2018-2019, Europe became aware of these changes, and it started to focus on economic profitability, also with raising security concerns. So from the position of seeing China as a potential partner, it started to look at China as economic competitor and also a strategic rival. The final wake-up call came with the war in Ukraine. Especially in Central and Eastern Europe, this support led to increasing willingness to treat Russia and China as similar actors. So there is a positive development in Europe, I have to say, with Ursula von der Leyen last year unveiling her strategy of de-risking from China, Critical Raw Materials Act, or the Defense of Democracy package, which I already mentioned. Yet these are coming in a relatively slow pace, and they are often a result of political compromise. In general, Europe's response to Chinese influence is halted by 4 different factors: a lack of capacity due to prioritization of war in Ukraine and Russia. The war in Ukraine has understandably made Russia the top priority, as it represents a clear and present danger to European security. China, in contrast, is seen as a longer-term strategic challenge, particularly in the economic domain. The second problem stems from a lack of political will to deal with China. Despite de-risking strategy being announced last year, Europe remains interdependent to China. The lack of political will to take more assertive stance towards China has created divisions within Europe's response to Beijing. While some European countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic have adopted more confrontational stances. Others, such as Germany and France, are more hesitant due to significant economic ties and reliance on trade with China. Yet there are also outliers, as was mentioned here, Serbia, Hungary, but also Slovakia. The risk is that such outlier countries may influence others, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where the temptation to secure future economic deals with China remains very strong. As a result, Europe's collective response to China is fragmented. The third problem lies in limited expertise on China within European countries, their ministries, and also counterintelligence services. And finally, European public perceive China as a distant threat, shown by all public surveys we have in our depository. So there is a rather limited popular demand for tougher actions. Moving forward, strengthening Europe's resilience to Chinese influence will require a more coordinated, European-led effort with an emphasis on internal capacity building and strategic independence. The US, as well as other like-minded partners such as Japan, Australia, or South Korea, can help in sharing best practices, showing understanding for European economic interests, and coordinating cyber defense efforts. US can play a significant role in addressing the challenges posed by outlier governments in Europe, such as those in Hungary, Serbia, and increasingly Slovakia. The US should reassure these governments that they can expect continued investments and economic opportunities from Europe and the US. On the other hand, it must communicate the red lines and that certain behaviors will not be tolerated. The US should recognize that China positions within the European governments could change quickly as a result of elections in the Czech Republic, in Germany, but also in France, and cultivate cross-party dialogue on China. Thank you for the opportunity to present these insights today. I look forward to engaging with the members of the subcommittee during the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Karaskova. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. The PRC is providing a lifeline for Russia's war effort in Ukraine, exporting an enormous amount of dual-use goods to boost Russia's defense industrial base. In April, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell revealed that Russia's military has been, quote, reconstituted thanks to this assistance from China. Mr. Rao, in your own words, how has China's support for Russia's defense industrial base enabled Putin's ongoing war against Ukraine? And how would Putin's war effort in Ukraine be going if he didn't have this support from the PRC?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. Today, it's widely acknowledged that the PRC provides Russia with 70 to 90% of its computer numeric control machine tools, which are crucial for the automated production of precision-guided munitions and aircraft parts, and 90% of the microelectronics, which are critical for the production of missiles, tanks, and aircraft. I believe last April, General Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander of European Command, testified before the House Armed Services Committee that Russian military reconstitution is taking place at a much more rapid clip owing to PRC support. And I can tell you that in conversations with Biden administration officials, they see the Chinese support for the Russian war effort as absolutely essential to Russia's ability to take the number of casualties and reconstitute its armor and forces in Ukraine that it has over the past year. So it is the dramatic issue.
And how would you rate the efficacy of the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to sever this malign PRC support for Russia? And what more can and needs to be done?
I think rather than taking individual sanctions decisions against individual actors, the Biden administration might want to consider sectoral moves, including the potential threat of secondary sanctions against actors, for example, in Hong Kong, which is considered a major throughput for malign activity. So I would say that individual decisions and sanctioning decisions by the Biden administration have yet really to take on the totality of the PRC threat, and more probably should be done.
Thank you. European countries often speak about de-risking from the Chinese economy as opposed to decoupling from it. Dr. Rohach and Dr. Karaskova, what do you take de-risking to mean in the European context, and how would you grade Europe's progress on de-risking from China? Dr. Rohach first, and then Dr. Karaskova, please.
Thank you for this question. It's an important one. There is a great deal of ambiguity in the term de-risking, and the matter is made more complicated by the fact that you have 27 member states involved in this conversation where the perception of risk is very different. So as of now, there is very little in terms of a coherent European approach towards this question, even within individual countries such as Germany, where Chinese electric vehicles do represent a threat because of the subsidies and because of the explicit Chinese policies to dump excess capacity on the European market, a threat to the German industrial base. At the same time, you have important players in the German industry who are also benefiting from the economic ties to China. So these tensions do exist at the national level as well. We are nowhere near where we need to be in the United States in terms of decoupling from China, in terms of dual use technology and critical supplies of, say, minerals and so on and so forth. I think the conversation in Europe is, if anything, lagging further behind the United States. And I think this is one of those opportunities where US leadership would be really, really helpful in steering the conversation forward.
Thank you. Dr. Karaskova, same question.
The recently released custom data from 2018 to 2023 actually indicate that the European countries maintained or even increased their dependency on China. But I would like to stress that the de-risking strategy started only last year. So we will probably see that, hopefully, in the data coming from 2024 and onwards. But talking with the German businesses, which have a great deal and great interest in Chinese market, it seems that de-risking strategy offers also some loopholes for those who do not wish to comply. And German companies often interpret de-risking as just relocating their production more to China and taking on boards more Chinese partners, saying we are actually de-risking from the European push for us to be less present on Chinese market. We actually become European Chinese companies, and that's their interpretation of de-risking. So I'm a little bit skeptical here.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Keating for any questions that he may have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Karaskova, just if you could follow up, do you think that the recently elected European Commission, whether there'll be any change in this de-risking policy as a result of that newly elected commission?
I don't think so. I think that within the European Commission, especially with the president, there is still a great push towards de-risking strategy and towards making this happen. So there is a lot of announcement coming up from the new commission, or at least the plan for de-risking is continuing. Very much depend on how the economies would react to that. So we have experienced a record high in inflation in a number of European countries. We have also experienced energy shocks. And we do have governments which are now composed of far-right parties, which have a very different positioning on China and also on Russia. And we have more elections coming, as I said, the Czech Republic, but also Germany next month, and France as well. And that could actually hamper the European Commission position on de-risking. So I do see tensions between where the European Commission is heading and would like to head, and where the European governments may actually want European Commission to go when it comes to China and Russia.
How much effect does the actions of Hungary, Serbia, Slovenia, how much does that create that tension too, not just the election of more people from the far-right parties?
There's a problem because there is a big pull of gravity when it comes to Serbia. Serbia is the biggest country and the most influential country in Western Balkans. And there is a number of countries surrounding that which have seen that Vučić can get away with his position on both Russia and China, and it actually pays dividends. So they can think that this could be a viable model for them. And the same happens with Hungary. And we do see this with the new Slovak government led by Prime Minister Fico, that he's also taking a lot of inspiration from Hungary. So we may see a slow domino effect if this is not stopped. But you're absolutely right. Hungary, Serbia, and most increasingly Slovakia as well could be outliers, which may try to tilt that balance.
And then accompanying this, of course, is disinformation campaigns as well. So could you tell us about the effect of this, Chinese disinformation campaign as they use that in conjunction with some of the elections that are there to the more far-right people, and how can affect China and how they're using it to their advantage.
Initially, China was messaging to European countries the so-called, and I mentioned that already, positive energy, talking about Chinese culture, Chinese traditions, Chinese language, and so on. This changed in 2018, 2019, when China suddenly started to play by the Russian playbook. So suddenly started to sow distrust towards the governments, towards military, towards international organizations such as the NATO or the EU. So we do see Russia and China confluencing actually on this topic, and that started even before the war in Ukraine started. So we do see this convergence actually happening. China also started to be very blunt when it started to approach far right and far left movements. Originally, it started with the far left, then it moved across the board, and now it's actually talking with all the parties in Europe. And these are not limited only to amplifying the narratives and messages by far right, far left, but also by financial support to those fringe political parties and movements. There was a case in Germany last couple of months back when an assistant of Maximilian Krah, one of the MEPs for Alternative für Deutschland, was actually caught red-handed as giving information to his Chinese handlers on secret information from the European Parliament. And this is just the tip of an iceberg. But as I said, the counterintelligence services, to my belief, are not paying enough attention to that because everybody is occupied with Russia.
Yeah, and then I mentioned my opening remarks about the technology exchange in submarines and missiles with Russia and China as a result of Beijing's support for Russia. Time is running out, but has that caught the attention of European officials as well?
It did. Frankly speaking, there was already a recognition that the Chinese support to lend it to Russia is not only rhetorical or diplomatic or economic. That goes also towards the military area. And there was a suspicion already that it goes beyond the dual-use materials. So I don't think that it comes as a big shock.
Thank you all for coming in. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I now recognize Representative Self from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no doubt that China is on the move, at least for now, and we have an administration that will not hold them accountable. Certainly, fossil fuels, we could have Russia and Iran destitute today, should we chosen to do that. We talk a lot about soft power. This is a soft power discussion, but if you'll look at that chart that I gave you, China controls some of the hard assets, critical minerals. Now, you may remember the pandemic challenges for supply chains. You may remember the fossil fuel Nord Stream 2 example. When you control resources, you control economies. Now, by their own admission in the EU, let's look at the chart first. On the left side, and all the members have it as well, on the left side, you see some diversity on who mines these critical minerals, some diversity. On the right side, you see the refined supply, China, 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 right on down the line. Now, by their own admission, EU, 98% of their rare earths are controlled by China. 93% of their magnesium is controlled by China. 97% of their lithium is controlled by China. So as we talk about soft power, and we've seen recently, as I say, he who controls resources has a lot of control over your economy. I think one of you used the word blackmail, because I think this is a dangerous, now semiconductors we won't talk about, but this is a dangerous, and frankly, if we had not had a light winter in Europe after the Nord Stream was cut off, Germany would have been in real trouble. Europe would have been in real trouble. We had a light winter, so they made it through. So I just want to ask you, how in the world, and I'm following up on a conversation I had with Ambassador John Bass this morning, how in the world are we going to wean Europe and the United States. And oh, and as a side, Alaska alone has 49 of the 50 critical minerals. And we refuse to mine them in the United States to any great degree. So how in the world are we going to de-risk and decouple, whatever term you want to use, if 97, 93, 98% of critical minerals are controlled by China? Because the rest of this seems to be, yeah, we in America have the same problem. We look at them as the big warehouse in the sky, and yet we consider them a strategic adversary. We've got the same problem Europe does, but how in the world are we ever going to wean off Europe? We're discussing Europe. If these numbers apply, critical minerals, because this looks to me like blackmail material. Who wants to take it?
Sure, I'll just supplement your point, Congressman, that I think the Russian war strategy for the winter is to bomb Ukrainian critical infrastructure so that you essentially freeze the civilian population. To your point, the Europeans have at least belatedly pushed a Critical Raw Materials Act, which is supposed to, within the next 6 years by 2030, alleviate some of their dependencies in extraction, processing, and recycling, but they are overwhelmingly dependent on the PRC for rare earths. I suppose streamlining planning laws and chemical regulations across countries, developing joint financing would make sense. But in the end, what's critical here is political will on both sides of the Atlantic. And perhaps the Chinese sort of nascent blackmail in this area by withholding curbs of germanium and gallium, which are used for semiconductor applications in military communications equipments, causing a skyrocketing, almost a doubling of pricing in the past year.
And why did they put that in place?
This was
the results of a visit. It was direct blackmail. A visit by maybe Speaker McCarthy. I've forgotten the exact visit, but a visit of a U.S. official. They then turned it into blackmail by withholding germanium and gallium.
And it's now bound up in the European Union's attempt to defend itself against Chinese dumping in electric vehicles. We also have heard that in the coming weeks, there might be export controls on antimony, an obscure metal used in armor-piercing ammunition. So as the Chinese drip out these policy decisions, hopefully it will rattle Europe sufficiently to where we can forge a joint transatlantic response.
Okay, before we go, China is in trouble in many ways. Demographically, they haven't moved away from their construction model to grow. They're looking perhaps at deflation real quickly. Do you think that that is going to be a problem? Because they'll take the whole world down with them if they start a deflationary cycle.
No.
Silence.
I mean, the weakness of the Chinese economic model, I think, is becoming more and more apparent, and it is simultaneously good news for the countries of the West and bad news. It is good news because the Chinese are not quite as powerful as we might have expected them to be. The demographic outlook is bad. The unsustainability of the state-led, capital-intensive, capital-heavy development, I think, is becoming apparent. The sort of rate of return on investment is falling down, and I don't think China has the sources of domestic productivity growth that we enjoy in the United States, being a free and open economy that is attracting talent and capital from around the world. So that is good news. Simultaneously, the interlinkages that do exist are something that policymakers have to be aware of, and the way to deal with that is to...
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Self. Chair now recognizes Representative Titus for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we've heard a lot about the relationship between China and Hungary. Both have strong men leaders, both democratic backsliding, certainly in Europe with Hungary, human rights violations. 44% of Chinese investments in Europe go to Hungary, so that relationship is pretty established. But Dr. Karaskova, when she went to Budapest in May, and he met with Orban, and they established what they called an all-weather partnership. And as part of this, they signed several agreements that range from economic to cultural cooperation. Could you give us some more detail about those agreements and how they've had an impact, and maybe how that notion of this all-weather partnership might be spreading beyond Hungary?
Yeah, Hungary and Serbia seems to be the only countries which are actually benefiting from China currently when it comes to investments from Central and Eastern European countries. The other so-called 16+1, now 14+1 countries do not either eye the investment or they actually do not benefit that much. And there is a direct correlation between political stances of these two governments, I mean Hungarian and Serbian, and all those investment opportunities given by China. These two governments also, and forgive me for being so blunt, have very transactional and opportunistic nature. So they do not care that much about anti-corruption measures and so on. So I would still see those two as outliers and as a direct correlation between what their public stances and political stances are on this. If I may also go to the previous question, but I'm not sure about how this works. So maybe if there is a time, I would like to do that.
And I will come back to that. I also want to ask you why you think it's important for U.S. leaders to call out Orban's relationship with the PRC, now, especially in light of last night's debate. Trump's presidential relationships and his praise for Orban kind of undermine our transatlantic democratic values and cooperation. So could you comment on that?
It's a very tough question. I may perhaps reverse it and say that Mr. Orban is not very well regarded by a majority of the European governments. But by also saying that, I would like to say that he is admired by opposition leaders, usually those on the far right spectrum, which may actually make their avenues into the next governments. So this is a very, very shaky ground, very moving sense. But in general, the comments about Mr. Orban being very wise and smart and so on, I don't think they resonated in Europe in general.
How about opposition to him in Hungary?
Opposition unfortunately lost in last elections. There is still a significant, I would say, push, especially by Mayor of Budapest. But the population, unfortunately, perhaps, is very happy with Mr. Orban and with his policies. So I don't see any foreseeable change in the government.
All right, well, I'll yield the time, let you answer the question on the critical minerals since it seems to keep coming up in every hearing.
Thank you very much. It's very, very kind of you. I just wanted to perhaps say that rare earth and rare materials are actually not rare. They are quite prevalent. What is problematic here is that when you extract them, it's very pollutant, and Europeans do not like to pollute their grounds. As Europeans, I think we drop the ball when it comes to relationship with African countries due to historical grievances and also different priorities. So there is an increased attention paid to African countries, sub-Saharan countries in particular, but there is a lack of division of labor of the Europeans. So we do see that we have to do everything, and in the end, nobody's actually doing anything. So there's a problem in, I think, US-EU cooperation on actually dividing the countries, dividing the tasks, and pushing Europeans to be much more active when it comes to cooperation with our African partners. And we have seen FOCAC, the recent visit of leaders in Beijing and the cooperation between Africa and China, that Europeans are actually losing in this game to China.
I'll take my time back. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Rep. Costa for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's appropriate at this point in time that we look at the Chinese influence in Europe and, but more importantly, use this as an opportunity to talk about greater cooperation between our European allies and ourselves. Because for China, we share a similar challenge. China is an adversary, they're a competitor, and they're a vast market, and that makes it complicated. And I don't think in that matrix we have really ourselves, or the Europeans, have determined how we deal going forward with China's adversarial relationship with us, the attacks they have on us thousands of times a day in very subtle ways, both in our companies, their espionage, as well as attacks on our institutions, public institutions, and they do the same in Europe. And so what we haven't hit upon is a strategy. Do you think Russia and China are coordinating their malign influences and European nations are with us? And are these common goals or are these personal agendas? Who would like to take that on? Please, Dr. Roham.
Happy to, thank you. I think there's certainly a degree of coordination as exemplified by the no limits partnership reached between Putin and Xi. However, I think the cooperation between those two actors falls short of the degree of institutionalized alliance-like structure that we saw during the Cold War between the Soviet Union
and that's really
satellite
lacking. I
countries.
mean, I think the Europeans think that the Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, is one of the ways to address the differences. And I think they would also like to work with us in implementing tools to limit China's influence. What do you think of the possibilities of that?
I think the TTC has not lived up to the expectations, to put it mildly.
But for reasons why, first of all, it's a work in progress, I believe. And secondly, our collaboration on it, I think, has not been significant.
Well, and I think the matter just deserves a much greater sort of degree of ambition and urgency from policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic if we were to build truly integrated supply chains.
But isn't that where we're really missing out? I mean, when you look at our economy and the Europeans' economy and the opportunity to leverage that, is the lack of collaboration.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the negotiations over TTIP before 2016.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to remember the TTIP effort as well.
And I would like,
sadly, it was discarded along with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I think working with allies that share values is a far better way than these notion of tariffs, which are a tax on American consumers. And everybody can play that game, and we've seen it. So let me ask another question here, because it really, and I work closely with our European allies, and they see Hungary and Viktor Orban, that great defender of democratic values and institutions. Victor, where are you? Because they know what his game is all about. And so he's a problem child for Europe, and they're having to deal with it, even in this point in time where they have the chairmanship. But where are the opportunities to deal with the malign influences of Russia and China? We know what China's goals are. We know what Russia's goals are with their invasion of Ukraine. And clearly, Putin is a war criminal. Russia is a syndicate masquerading as a country with a mob boss called Putin. And their view is if they can succeed in Ukraine, then possibly Poland is next, or Romania, or the Baltic states. So where do we find the opportunities to collaborate with our allies here? I mean, is this not a seminal moment in world history?
I do think we need both carrots, deeper cooperation, but also sticks. When you look at Hungary, then the EV investments in places like indeed Hungary or Slovakia, there has been evidence that's being investigated by the Select Committee on the CCP that links some of these Chinese conglomerates to the events in Xinjiang and the genocide against the Uyghurs. We should not be afraid to actually, float the possibility of sanctioning these companies.
No, I agree.
And taking a much sort of tougher, more coercive stance.
Let's draw the line with TikTok. Begin there.
Forcing our allies to have to
Wholly
pick a
owned
side.
subsidiary of the Communist Party of China. Thank you. My time's expired, but take another shot at it.
Thank you. And I recognize Congressman Issa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to ask if any of you disagree to be the first to speak up. Do you disagree that China is a current threat to the stability of sub-Saharan Africa because of their activities, including destabilizing governments and taking over whole industries of raw materials? Okay. Do you agree that they have begun a serious attack on European institutions, including WIPO? Lastly, are any of you not aware that they stole the entire plan from CERN for the next generation of nuclear research and super collider? You're all aware of it. So then the question is, if all of that is true, that they're willing to compromise a whole continent, that they're willing to attack institutions, global institutions, and they're willing to steal the entire intellectual property designs for the next generation of research, the pride of Europe. You just have to type CERN and you can look, and it's nothing but what Europe is so proud of, all that's come out of that joint innovation that the United States has participated in since the 50s. If that's the case, then where is there a carrot left? The carrot is already that they steal everything with impunity. So now the question is, do we have the will with our European partners to begin using the stick of making it at least economically disadvantageous to them to do so? Anyone care to comment on that? Yes, ma'am.
Unfortunately not. So as Dr. Rohach already said, Europe is fragmented, and I completely agree with that there are governments who are willingly in next elections. And second, they go extra mile because of the partnership with the US, not necessarily because they actually understand China threat. They knew what the Chinese government stands for. So it's very fragile, very fragmented. And I absolutely agree that we are out of carrots. Maybe the carrots could be in climate change, but honestly speaking, who cares about climate change, sincerely?
I'll leave that one where it started. My follow-up question really, though, is if China is as fragile economically as they appear to be today, they refuse to honor their, literally it was announced today, their HBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corporation. They had promised tens of billions of dollars of backstop on their bad real estate loans. And if Hong Kong Bank, or it goes by the letters now, had to announce that, no, the Bank of China has decided they're not going to honor that. If that's the case, am I wrong, or should the United States and this body look at this as our our hardest tool, but with the least kinetic damage, is in fact an all-out economic attack, if you will, on the underpinnings of China, which is their situation in which they've been allowed to print money even more freely than the United States. They've done so, and the reality is they're not loaning money to anybody. They're actually taking your money and giving it back to you in the form of a loan. Am I missing anything, or do we essentially have what appeared to be a tiger that is, in fact, when you look at their current financial condition, they're a paper tiger? Especially if we cut off the flow of clandestine oil and natural gas to them.
One possible caveat to this would be concerns over the health of our own financial industries, both in Europe and in the United States. And we've seen financial contagions unfold in the past. I think the exact mechanisms and downside risks are not well understood even among economists. So I would have some sympathy for those who would urge caution in exercising this.
Well, and I agree with you, and I'll just close by saying I agree with you, and I use that extreme for a reason. There is no soft landing if in fact the see-through buildings are what they appear to be throughout China. The question is, how can we solve it? How can we do what we need to do to China, which is recognize their false construction and their false wealth, and at the same time protect institutions in Europe and the United States? If we do nothing, we will eventually hit a cliff. So the question for the record, I know, Chairman, we have to go, is in fact ideas that would allow us to begin moving in that direction at a pace that isn't catastrophic.
Well, I think there's some very easy low-hanging fruit where we can begin. One is China's subversion of Europe's critical infrastructure, which is important also for our military posture. The Chinese have state-owned enterprises with major shareholders in 4 of the 5 Europe's major ports, in Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, Valencia, Spain. Logink, a Chinese Ministry of Transportation unified logistics platform, is embedded in at least 9 European ports, also Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg. So there is, I think, an opportunity to work with the Europeans, at least extricating our own vulnerabilities from the Chinese on critical infrastructure, and then move to the next stage of de-risking and decoupling, ultimately made more complex by the fact that, unlike the Cold War, the United States and the PRC have interwoven economies, and I think we have to be delicate and deft and intelligent in the way that we do de-risk, de-link, and ultimately decouple our economies from China without damaging our own wealth and prosperity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Issa. With no further questions from members, I want to thank our witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional written questions for the witnesses, and we want to ask you to respond to these promptly and in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.